It's 12:47 a.m. on December 20th, 1989, and Panama City is about to experience a night that will forever change the face of modern special operations warfare. 4 Little Bird helicopters slice through the darkness like apex predators moving in for the kill, and aboard those aircraft are 23 Delta Force operators, the absolute tip of the American military spear. Their mission target is Cárcel Modelo, a fortified concrete prison nightmare that sits so close to Manuel Noriega's Comandancia headquarters that the two locations almost share the same shadow. Inside that prison, in a cell surrounded by brutal guards and locked behind heavy steel, sits one American, Kurt Muse. And tonight, he's about to be part of the most audacious rescue operation Delta Force has ever executed. But think about this for a second. Why would the Pentagon, why would the entire United States military establishment risk soldiers' lives and potentially derail an entire invasion operation just to pull one prisoner out of a fortress-like building in downtown Panama? What makes Kurt Muse so important that Delta Force commanders decided this rescue couldn't wait, couldn't be put off, had to happen right now? The answer is both simple and terrifying, because Kurt Muse isn't just a prisoner. He's a hostage. He's a CIA operative who spent the past year running clandestine radio broadcasts against Manuel Noriega's brutal dictatorship, and Noriega didn't just want to keep him locked away in Cárcel Modelo. Noriega had made it crystal clear that if the United States attempted any military action, if anyone dared to come for Muse, he was dead. And to make absolutely sure of it, Noriega stationed a dedicated guard outside Muse's cell. That guard's only job, his sole purpose for existing in that prison, was to execute Muse the moment rescue forces appeared. That's the nightmare scenario Delta Force commanders were flying toward. That's what kept military planners awake at night, as they tried to figure out how to accomplish something that seemed impossible. Understanding the situation on the ground is crucial here. Kurt Muse had lived in Panama most of his life, raised under Noriega's iron-fisted control. For years, he'd watched the dictator brutalize the Panamanian people, suppress any hint of freedom, crush any voice that dared to speak against him. Muse owned a publishing company, had connections to American intelligence, and in late 1987, he made the decision that would change everything. He decided he was done accepting this dictatorship. He decided he would fight back. So Muse and his friends began smuggling in low-tech radio equipment and setting up clandestine transmission stations throughout Panama City. They started broadcasting anti-Noriega messages on frequencies that overrode the dictator's government-controlled radio network. They built a following. They inspired people. They gave voice to those who'd been silenced. But Noriega's security forces eventually caught Muse. When they did, he wasn't sent to just any prison. He was thrown into Cárcel Modelo, a notorious facility known for torture, brutal conditions, and the slow breaking of the human spirit. Muse spent 9 months in that prison, subjected to abuse and starvation, locked in solitary confinement, knowing that his life hung by an increasingly thin thread. And then came December 1989, when the United States finally decided it was time to remove Noriega from power. Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama, was about to begin. But before the tanks could roll and the main invasion forces could hit their targets, there was one critical objective that had to be accomplished first: get Kurt Muse out of Cárcel Modelo before Noriega could execute him. Picture what the planners at Delta Force were working with. The prison sits right in the middle of Panama City's downtown, close enough to Noriega's headquarters that you could practically hear conversations from one building to the other. It's surrounded by Panamanian Defense Force soldiers. It's fortified. It's overcrowded with inmates and guards. And the intelligence on the interior layout wasn't perfect. The Delta planners had to rely on information from an American doctor who'd been treating Muse inside the prison. So they had a general idea of where Muse was located and roughly how the building was organized, but they didn't have perfect, detailed intelligence. They didn't have architectural blueprints. They didn't have exact guard positions. What they did have was courage, training, and a willingness to attempt something that seemed crazy. Lieutenant Colonel Eldon Bargewell, a legendary commando who commanded a squadron of Delta Force, looked at this situation and decided that the best approach wasn't a long siege, wasn't a complex infiltration, wasn't some drawn-out tactical dance. The best approach was audacity, speed, overwhelming force. The plan was so simple in concept that it seemed reckless. Land on the roof, Go down 2 flights of stairs, blow open the cell door, grab Muse, and get out. Total time on target, 6 minutes. Maybe less if everything went perfectly. The soldiers would insert via 4 MH-6 Little Bird helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers. A security element would establish positions on the rooftop and lay suppressive fire against any threats from adjacent buildings. A rescue element would move through the prison at absolute speed, eliminating guards who resisted, securing guards who surrendered, and moving toward Muse with single-minded purpose. One operator would rappel down the exterior of the building near Muse's cell window, hanging in midair as a human shield to ensure that the execution guard couldn't carry out his orders. The Delta operators in 2 Troop, a squadron trained for this mission obsessively in the weeks leading up to the operation. They rehearsed on a mock-up of the prison. They drilled their breaching techniques. They practiced their movement patterns. They memorized the layout from photographs. They trained until the motions became pure muscle memory, until they could execute the plan in near darkness with rounds coming at them from multiple directions. Minutes before 1 a.m. on December 20th, 1989, the Little Birds launched from Howard Air Force Base. The prison was only a short flight away. As the helicopters approached Cárcel Modelo, something incredible was already happening overhead. 2 AC-130 Spectre gunships were positioning themselves over downtown Panama City. These weren't ordinary aircraft. These were flying fortresses, each carrying a 105mm howitzer that could punch holes through reinforced concrete, 40mm autocannons that could shred a building, and .50 caliber miniguns that could cut down soldiers at 1,000 meters. The gunships had call signs that would become legendary: Iron Maiden and Bad Company. Their crews were about to create absolute devastation specifically designed to keep Noriega's forces so pinned down, so overwhelmed, so desperate for survival, that they wouldn't be able to focus on what was happening at Cárcel Modelo. The gunships opened fire on the Comandancia, the PDF headquarters complex nearby. And when I say opened fire, I mean they unleashed everything they had. 40mm rounds and 105mm high-explosive projectiles started tearing through reinforced concrete walls, ripping through the buildings, turning night into day with massive explosions and muzzle flashes that lit up the entire downtown area. The sound was deafening, the spectacle overwhelming, the suppressive effect complete. Every PDF soldier in the area was either seeking cover or returning fire at the sky, unable to do anything except try to survive. This was the window. This was when Delta Force moved. The 4 MH-6 Little Birds approached Cárcel Modelo's rooftop. As they hovered and began insertion, Panamanian soldiers from adjacent buildings immediately opened fire. The response was instantaneous. Delta operators returned fire with precise, controlled aggression. Snipers identified guards on nearby towers and engaged them. Machine gunners laid suppressive fire across the prison courtyard. It was controlled chaos. Every operator knew exactly what his role was. Every movement was executed with the precision that only comes from months of intensive training. The rooftop door came next. The explosives team had prepared a massive shaped charge, expecting heavy reinforcement. But the door turned out to be relatively ordinary. When the charge detonated, the explosion shook the entire building. Then the assault team was moving through, descending those 2 flights of stairs toward Muse's cell. 2 minutes into the operation, the rescue team was moving through the prison corridors. They encountered resistance. 2 guards were killed in sharp, immediate tactical exchanges. Another guard was encountered who didn't resist. He was immediately secured and zip-tied, unharmed. This is Delta Force philosophy: deadly when necessary, restrained when possible. There's no wasted violence, only precise, surgical action. They reached Muse's cell door. The operator who'd rappelled down outside the window hadn't found the execution guard. Maybe he'd gone somewhere else. Maybe he wasn't there that night. Maybe the intelligence had been wrong. Whatever the reason, the precaution wasn't needed. But the cell lock was stronger than expected. They shot it twice. Nothing. There was no time to waste. So they placed a shaped charge on the door and detonated it. The explosion ripped the heavy door open. Muse was told to get into his bathroom, literally to crouch in that tiny space to avoid being hit by flying debris from the blast. Then the transformation happened. Body armor appeared. A ballistic helmet was placed on his head. Goggles were adjusted over his eyes. He went from a terrified prisoner to a soldier being extracted, and then he was moving, running through corridors with armed professionals surrounding him, moving back toward that rooftop. But this is where everything goes sideways. One of the MH-6 little birds, heavily loaded with Muse and the retrieval team, took off from the rooftop. The pilot immediately discovered he couldn't gain altitude. The helicopter was too heavy. So the pilot did something extraordinary. He drove the little bird down the street at rooftop level, in what pilots call ground effect, turning away from the prison entrance. The aircraft made a hard landing on a street near the prison. Everyone jumped off to establish a defensive position. The pilot assessed the situation and determined he could try again. Everyone reboarded the helicopter. It took off, began climbing, and that's when the machine gun fire found them. The aircraft was stitched from rotor to tail boom with rounds. Pat Savage was shot in the leg. Kelly Vinden was shot in the abdomen. The helicopter crashed, wounding several operators. James Sutterth, a Delta sergeant, had his foot caught under the helicopter's skids when it crashed. He actually lifted the entire aircraft enough for himself to escape. That's how wounded operators' minds work in these situations, pure survival instinct overriding pain and shock. But the operators didn't panic. They didn't freeze. They established a defensive position in a nearby building. One of them grabbed an infrared strobe light, a beacon invisible to the human eye but visible to aircraft with night vision equipment. They signaled their position to the AC-130 gunships orbiting above. Within minutes, armored personnel carriers from the 5th Infantry Division came roaring toward them, M113s carrying reinforcements and medics. Muse was extracted. All the wounded operators were recovered. Everyone lived. The entire operation lasted 6 minutes. Years later, James Sutterth recovered from his injuries. Despite losing several toes in the crash, he went on to graduate from Combat Diver School, one of the most brutally difficult special operations courses in the entire Army. That's the level of commitment, resilience, and dedication these soldiers possess. They don't stop. They don't quit. Kurt Muse survived Cárcel Modelo. He survived the rescue operation. He survived the helicopter crash. And years later, he collaborated with author John Gilstrap to write a book called 6 Minutes to Freedom, documenting the entire ordeal. What makes this operation revolutionary is what it established. This was Delta Force's first major successful hostage rescue operation in history, and every doctrine, every tactic, every technique that special operations forces use for hostage rescue from that night forward was influenced by what happened in Panama City. When you watch videos of modern special operations raids, when you hear about contemporary hostage rescues, you're watching the legacy of Operation Acid Gambit. The speed, the precision, the willingness to attempt the impossible, all of it traces back to those 6 minutes in 1989.